So hi, we're going to be taking a look today between ancient wisdom and the philosophies therein. And we're going to be moving on looking at the Enlightenment and the revolutions that happened during the Enlightenment period. And we will also be looking at modernity and science. I'm also going to then move through to the cultural exchange and the synthesis between the East and the West, and then also contemporary challenges and opportunities. So it's between looking at comparison and contrast in many ways between the East and the West. I'll be using this GraphXR. It's very useful to use as well. I find it's a 3D virtual space where into which I have loaded a great many nodes and knowledge graphing, as you'll see as we go through. So part of which is the map, but you soon find as you start to do what I'm doing, which is a contrast and compare between East and West, West and East, particularly from the point of view of Buddhism, that spatial, the spatial aspect, the geographical spatial aspect is only a small part of it. And at certain times, as you get into the discussion, it's not relevant at all. And then there's the time aspect. So if you're talking more from sociological and anthropological aspects, it's a huge factor. But one of the epithets of the Buddha's teaching is timeless, beyond time, akaliko. Kali meaning time. Akaliko means beyond time. Because it focuses on mind and matter, matter and mind integrating, so the contact between the two, and personally experiential, which is in a way much more like phenomenology, the study directly of sensations as they happen. You find that when we look into Western approaches to philosophy, psychology, psychiatry, and anthropology, and so on, that something else happens is many of those disciplines date quite quickly. They go out of time as scientific discoveries happen, and as political and social trends change. Someone can be very influential for sort of 45 or 75 years, and gradually their ideas get disproven, or society moves on and leaves their trend of their ideas behind somehow. They're gender-centric, or they are centric to their part of the world. But the Buddhist teachings are not so much like that. Right, so I thought we'd start with other ancient wisdom and philosophies. This is not meant to be a pulpit. It's meant to be a very broad and fair overview. So Eastern philosophies and Eastern thought has a very sort of distinct aspect, and it has had many various influences of different kinds. And not just only the Buddha. We've had some tyrants like Mao Zedong, for example, who tried to instill agrarian communism and hated religion and took his ideas from Karl Marx and was responsible directly and indirectly for millions of deaths, which is the tendency that we've seen with socialist extremism. Okay, so there have been a number of different Eastern philosophies that have been influenced from the Silk Road, and they've been influenced from, from India and from Greek culture, including Buddhism, which was largely taken over, carried in from Greek translations of one particular school. But here are some of the influences and the ideas, the schools and the people. Tibetan Buddhism, legalism, Confucianism, the 100 schools of thought, the philosophies of Wu Wei, Lao Tzu, and Daoism, the ideas of such as yin and yang. So some of these do harmonize with Buddhism, some of them don't. Some of them are assumed to be Buddhist and aren't, actually. And this has gone through a great many changes. In the back there we have this idea of Ren here. And this became very, Ren means people. So, with the People's Republic and so on, so you get sort of various versions of what Ren is about. But it also includes humanistic Buddhism, which seeks to do away with the sort of post-mortem versions of and use of religion, that it's all about what happens to you after you die. And that can also lead to a great deal of emphasis on ritual, and that affects the nature and the perception of monastics and priests and nuns and their function. So often then it turns into a system of sort of bribing the gods for favourable conditions after life, particularly in China, where it got conflated with the relationships of the family and parents and children. If a person doesn't actually have to do any particular spiritual work and can have quite a busy life full of wanton debauchery, mistresses and alcohol, and then their children can make up the difference later on, then that is has often been the way that creates a sort of theory which is preferred, where their children can do the spiritual work and pay for their sins, as it were, kind of thing. So that's just a bit of a brief overview of some of the ideas in Chinese Eastern philosophy that have varied through a great deal of different eras. Confucius was a big influence with his very structured approach, which is quite different to the Tao by Lao Tzu. Lao Tzu's philosophy was very much more nature-based originally, and more in the extreme of being very in tune with nature and very metaphysical and very nature philosophical. So if you can be like the bamboo, if you can be like the river, if you can be like the wind, then there's no difference between you and nature. So learning from nature and becoming as nature. And then gradually those ideas become deified and then eternalized as well. So then you get eternal Taoist deities. It's a transition. That's a very quick snap view of things. I've seen a dramatization of a discussion between Lao Tzu and Confucius, whereas Confucius was very much more about structured roles. He had no time for afterlife and talk about that kind of thing. He had a mission to put in place in frequently chaotic and warring times. He had a mission much more to spread an idea where every sibling and every parent has a role and knows their place, and in a class system every person a ruler and every person in society has their role and knows precisely what that role is and what to do and how to behave, and until an incredible amount of detail becomes. So that's very, very different than the idea of wandering through the mountains and becoming one with nature and just developing this way. That's very, very different to this sort of social, almost political. And he had a dream of becoming a statesman. He was definitely intent on fitting in. So you have in the Tao, Lao Tzu's Tao Te Ching, a very much fluid, non-conformist way of going off away from society, whereas Confucian was more about statescraft and imposing order. So very, very contrasting. And both have had their influence. As you can see, rules and regulations and guidelines and structure go into Confucius ideas. Correctness in social relationships, justice, kindness, and sincerity. So very much a virtues ethic, very much taking the emphasis away from heaven and hell and spirits and goblins and demons and ghosts and priests and monastics and so on. He had a following, but he was very peripatetic. He was a wanderer for a great many periods of time and went through phases of also of harsh poverty living as well. Yeah, so let's move to Buddhism and now the Buddha Dharma teachings also span that amount of time, as Confucian, still being talked about today, still being practiced today. So, and that's the same with the Buddha Dharma teachings. And this also contrasts with the Greeks, ancient Greeks, who were, several of them from around the time of the Buddha, and Greece being surrounded by the ocean and linked to the great trade routes, would have had the capacity to travel across water around to India. So the Buddha Dharma teaching is very structured and very well retained through recitation. All of it was initially orally transmitted. At that time, it seems like paper and writing and printing was just not available technically. But it's also held in somewhat mistrust. What was really trusted was oral, verbal teachings, and therefore rote memorization. So it's their view of paper and writing and books and folding scriptures and scrolls was probably seen somewhat like artificial intelligence is now, with somewhat suspicion about its effect that it can have. And therefore, also this need to have a structured school was clear to the Buddha. He had seen it with Mahavira's Jain structure that was an existent school, and he learned very much, and saw definitely how a well-organized collective can endure. The Greeks not so much emphasis. I mean, with Socrates, we had a peripatetic teacher who also, like the Buddha, walked around a lot and taught, by walking here and walking there and walking here and walking there. He did do that. With Plato and Aristotle, you did have organization of structure with the Lyceum and the Academy. And also with Plato, you had an effort at getting involved, not only with metaphysical things like the cave analogy but also with statecraft. He wrote a book called The Republic, and he was definitely trying to get involved in politics to explain his theories on how things should be run, ideally by people like him, enlightened philosophers. They should be the kings, as opposed to the rule of the mob. He had seen his master Socrates murdered vicariously through a kangaroo court that forced him to make a decision about whether he should accept his punishment, which was poisoned by hemlock. And so you see this, the idea of a structured teaching that will endure. You see the wisdom of the Buddha, who didn't over-involve in politics, and he highly discouraged his followers and students from doing so. He was very harmonious to the ruling elite, no matter what kind of people they were. Many of them were tyrannical and militaristic, and he was able to calmly and slowly and gently realign them with pacifist values, such as King Asoka and King Pasenadi and the kings of those states around him, Kosala kingdoms, Bimbisara. These were people who were initially very warring, and he managed to pacify them. So you can see that in contrast to, say, Jesus Christ, who was quite a provocative Messiah. He was a provocative person in his teachings, and he was also somewhat of a political activist, directly confronting and exposing and shaming those cultures. So I think we see a change, a difference and a contrast that we can compare there between the methods and approaches and attitudes of the Buddha, who was raised very much in statecraft and expected to be, we are told, a leader himself. So you can see there that there are many different aspects on this graph of the Buddha Dharma teachings. Probably, let's have a look at, say, let's just take a look around some of the ones that are recorded here. Modern times now we have humanistic Buddhism. Again, this is the idea of Ren Jian Fo Jiao. This idea largely came about through two monks in China and then moving over to Taiwan. That's Master Taixu and Master Yin Shun. And they had both seen a decayed form of what they considered to be a decaying form of, or corrupted form of Buddhism that needed purifying. But they were also in the time where there was the fomenting of the people's religions, or the people's idea, so which led to communism, and very, very socialized ideas. So in that time, the emphasis starts to come away from spirits and ghosts and funeral rites and the afterlife, and more they try to put the emphasis back onto ordinary life, earthly achievements, and reconnecting the Buddhist practice to every life. That's the idea of a Ren, of the people. So this is actually, we've now made a bit of a time jump, as you can see. It's early 20th century. Buddhism for human life and humanistic Buddhism. So he also had ideas about radically reducing the amount of monks. So I personally have mixed feelings about that. Someone who wants to do such a radicalization, they may as well be a communist, because let's not go there. All right, so let's take a look at some other aspects of Buddhism. We have, what's this one say? I just want to have a zoom in, if I can just see what that says. Come on, please. Is it? Theravada Buddhism categories. Let's go take a look at that one. Let's go through here and take a look. So these would be some sort of ideas and things connected. I mean, Theravada Buddhism is huge in Thailand and Sri Lanka and Cambodia, and it was largely brought over by the Pali Text Society to Western culture. Noble Eightfold Path, the Vinaya, which is the discipline of the monks, still kept today rigorously. Some key people, Ayya Khema and Nun. Mogali Putatissa, one of the contemporaries of the Buddha, one of his students. The Thai forest tradition, which is very popularized in the West, almost made like a franchise, with people like Ajahn Brahmavamso in Australia, and people like Ajahn Sumedho in the UK, and Ajahn Thanissaro, such kind of people that have rejuvenated a great sort of interest. Ajahn Chah, one of the main mentors of those three people that I just mentioned, that branch that has enjoyed great popularity. So, let's see what else we have here. The Four Noble Truths, the key teaching, Ledi Sayadaw, mindfulness, become enormously interest in the West, which was sort of looking for some way for psychology, psychotherapy, and philosophy to have something we can do that's not so confusing or expensive or technology driven, but adheres well enough to healthy teachings that isn't also religious, pseudo-religious, or sort of hippie or new age, and mindfulness sort of went into that vacuum and that void to become extremely useful, and also applied very much in daily life by people such as John Kabat-Zinn in America, mixing it also with a kind of medical model. The middle way, avoiding extremes, which in a time of the golden age of porn, and then mass marketing and online selling, and on the other extremes of anorexia, that we needed a middle way teaching that could be easily integrated. So Analayo and Ajahn Brahm mentioned there, a high scholar and a very popularizing with his sort of Reader's Digest style Dhamma that's easily absorbed by everyone, but also just deep enough, and in popularizing of meditation. Nibbana, the ultimate aim. So Anagarika Dhammapala, a very key person who took and visited William James in America at one of the key universities and gave talks early on. Bhikkhu Bodhi, one of the main translators of text. So quite a few things there. Buddhism, enormously important throughout. Mahayana Buddhism and Thai Buddhism, Japanese Buddhism, Zen Buddhism, schools of Buddhism. Yeah, I think, and let's have a quick look at Vajrayana. That's quite different than Theravada. It's a later edition. It's much, much younger, whereas Theravada is 2,550 years old, whereas Vajrayana is about 700 years old. And it's been absorbed into Tibetan culture, Bhutanese culture, and so on. There's many places where it's practiced. How do I navigate up to the actual sphere above it? It's like learning to fly a UFO doing this. So what are all those up there? Just want to see what those blue ones, I think that's a Vajrayana sphere, which is what I was actually looking for. I was hoping that one was going to be. Vajrayana. Let's just go take a look at Vajrayana. Vajra is a diamond. That's the one. No, it isn't. That's the one. 118 points. Nodes. Mr. Nodes was one of my masters at school, ahead of his time, obviously. So let's have a quick look at some of the things along there. Yantra. One of my main teachers, Bhante Punyaji, used to talk about mantra, tantra, yantra, mantra, tantra, by sequences. Yantra is where the powers that be are very far away, up in the clouds and beyond in space, and you have no control over them. And then only through priests can you communicate with the gods, a bit like ancient Greek. So yantra. And then mantra, there's yantra. So mantra, where you start being able to connect with spirituality by chanting. And then tantra, where you are directly responsible, directly with no priests and no gods. It's just you and life. It's like phenomenology, tantra. So other ideas that have gone there. Okay, I mean, you'll find, particularly with many Theravadins, they do not trust these teachings at all, because there's quite a lot of other things that are in there that are directly contradictory to Theravada. Say, for example, such as the involvement of sexual intercourse at times in the tantric texts, and then other kind of different practices. There's yap yum is one of those, and obviously that's seen as a big no-no, or a way that the Sangha, the teachers, can become corrupted as well. So quite, not without its controversies. Then we have the knowledge by report of Bhutan being probably the happiest kingdom on the planet. And they wholeheartedly practice the spectrum of Vajrayana teachings. Okay, so let's move from the East to Enlightenment time. Now, Enlightenment has kind of a duo meaning. It means the Buddha's enlightenment is one thing. That happened 2,550 years ago, and that meant the discovery of Nibbana. It had nothing to do with microscopes, telescopes, and scientific inquiry of evolution and botany and space travel and so on. But European Enlightenment did. It had a very different tone, so we shouldn't confuse the two. So these are some of the ideas involved with European Enlightenment. It's the age of reason. So I read, there's a very interesting book called The Golden Bough. This is by someone called Sir James Fraser, James G. Fraser. And he sat in his study in Scotland, and he received lots and lots and lots of reports from the British colonial military and missionaries and merchants about what they saw in the places they went to, which was 75% of the world dominated at that time and invaded and enslaved in many senses. But what they saw were the indigenous practices, and they would get then reported back to England, and that got to Sir James Fraser. And then he wrote this book, Goldman. He read all those, and he created a theory that there was a progression from magical, mystical thinking to religious thinking, which was semi-organized magical thinking, that then progressed to scientific thinking. So you had kind of voodoo, native, original kind of paganistic practices that then became organized under a collective governance and so on. So this is seen through his eyes, that then progressed to the mastery and understanding of true cause and effect, which is through reason and rationality. So that was that progress of magic to religion to science, was James Fraser's brief. So if you take a look at the Golden Power, it's enormous. I mean, it's 7 volumes, but if you get one of the versions of it to have a listen to, or the condensed version, it's worth it. People like Camille Paglia, a American contemporary feminist, was enormously inspired by it as a work of speculative, what do you call it? Speculative research, application of research, something like that. But it's interesting, this idea of magical thinking, which is very much like a sort of neurotic version, leading up to actual, so that's a sort of, mythological, invented version of the way things. So you offer such and such to a tree, and the tree will then give you a good harvest. Or if you want to affect the weather, you make offerings of valuable things to the clouds and say sacred chants, and that will have the effect of pleasing the weather gods, and so on. And then later on people learn about thermodynamics and so on, and they change the way that they relate to the forces of nature. So this was, and there, obviously the religion had an enormous amount of power because of those myths, and it empowered the clergy enormously, which they abused rigorously by the persecution of witches and who were practicing nature law, craft and paganism, and that they resisted, Galileo and Copernicus, people who were scientists who sometimes would recant and sometimes wouldn't, and often would be burnt alive as a consequence of trying to explain the laws of science, which undermined the church. So that's the period of time we're talking about, the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution. So people like Locke and Voltaire, let's have a look at some of the Enlightenment thinkers. There's an enormous amount of them. So let's let go of the ideas of progress that were going on there and go to the thinkers. These are some of the names of some of the key people: Montesquieu, Leibniz, and Tyndall, Spinoza, Baruch Spinoza. All of these people, so Spinoza was part of a Jewish community in Amsterdam, and he was thrown out of his community through saying what he was saying, which was largely, most of these people, therefore, many of them anyway, were atheistic, whether they were overtly saying it or not. The implication of what they were revealing, there's John Locke, for example. The implication of what they were saying was that things were not working the way that the church has been saying, which was with the Abrahamic bearded figure in the sky who would get with a bad temper and would make demands on people to murder their children because he felt like it was a good test of their faith in Hume. It's very patriarchal, this idea of the Daic theist up there punishing and ruling and commanding and making things happen, where there were tidal waves or volcanoes, that it was caused, that God was seen as the first cause. Okay, so there's John Locke. I just want to see whether we've got an actual John Locke. I don't think I have an actual sphere dedicated to him. I think he's just in there with the British empiricists. But the empiricists were having enormous courage to confront the church as they saw the benefits that would come from doing that. So it's understandable. You had other people like David Hume, for example, of the British empiricists, Bishop George Buckley, and Hobbes. Scotus is another thing altogether. So Hume had several ideas that he refuted. Let's just take a look at these. There were four main ones, which it summarizes the mood of the times here. So these are the views rejected by David Hume. Here above there. So firstly, this idea of, belief in God as a substance. And this was, for example, when we're looking back at the Greeks, some of the earlier Greeks were playing around with this idea. Thales, one of the earliest, that there is a first primary form, a kind of Holy Spirit underneath or behind, or that everything is made out of. Also that has an organic intelligence and it turns itself into everything, one thing at a time. So that's all belief in God as a substance or as a sort of plasma throughout the universe that has this enormous high intelligence. So he refuted that. So then we get this sort of godless mechanical view of the universe that was to lead to quite a lot of trouble through nihilism. Once you take away the idea of a teleological universe, a universe that has purpose, that was designed by a creator with a meaningful story to it built in, belief in God as a substance is a key part of it. So David Hume firstly refuted that and got away with it. So he didn't get burned to the stake. So times were changing. Belief in a first cause of the universe, the beginning of time, the beginning of existence. So he was refuting the book of Genesis's version of the beginning. So you see in Einstein and you see in even people like Nietzsche, but you see, and in the Buddha as well, in some of them you get an eternal return where there's a cyclic version of events going on. But Hume refuted and refused to believe in this idea of a first cause, and often this came about as seeing cause and effect as a kind of coexistent chain. So the Buddha actually recommended staying away from this question, that it just led to quarrelling and to endless disputes, literally endless. They wouldn't ever go on. So the people who believe in the Big Bang refute the people who believe in an eternal return, like Einstein, and these two will constantly argue and never accept the other's point of view, no matter what they believe. The third thing that Hume refuted was the belief in the immortality of the soul. That idea that if you believe in Jesus and that's it, you're in, you've accepted him. Once the physical body dies, your soul goes into an immortal state. So that was, he didn't say there's any such thing as he said there's no such thing as an immortal soul, whatever you call the soul. And then defining a little bit more about the soul itself, what is it? This belief in the soul as a unity, a one thing. Whether that one thing is a sort of spirit, the version of your body, or it's a sort of spherical light that inhabits your heart or your brain, or all of humanity is one soul, or all the universe is a soul. But whatever this version, there's many different versions of the idea of soul as unity. He said he doesn't believe in any of that. So a lot of that also can come from what the Buddha called Ucheda Ditti, which is identification with the body. So that can also be a reason for someone says, no, there's no God as a substance. We don't have to, I don't know all that stuff about the first cause of the universe. They don't really know. They weren't there. We weren't there. We just believe in what we can empirically see with our eye, ear, nose, and tongue. That's called empiricism, empirical. What you can only know what you can experience from your senses. Right, so Voltaire was another one. Let's see where Voltaire shows up. I think here he's just a single node again, but he's in France. So Voltaire, key Enlightenment thinker. And let's just look at him on this left-hand graph, because that is able to see the minutiae of the graph. So he shows up obviously in the Age of Enlightenment thinkers. There he is. Let's zoom in and see who he's close with, just visually on the graph. Descartes, also French, with his famous, I'm trying to remember the Latin, but it's I think therefore I am, which is also not confluent, it's not with the Buddha. The Buddha says that would just be identifying with thinking, Descartes. Ergo sum, I remember the Latin off the top of my head. I saw Schiller in there. Schiller was also someone I'd like to look at in a forthcoming thing. Schiller is a German romantic poet. So quite a lot of... Who else have we got going around there? Enlightenment thinkers. Let's have a look also under... He features Voltaire under social and political philosophy. I'd like to see how he fits in there. Let's zoom to social and political philosophy. Here he is. So you can see under this category, there he is at the back, by the way. I'm just zoomed out a bit. Here's Voltaire. Under that categorization, interestingly, he gets close to people, even including people like Confucius, because Confucius was a social and political philosopher. He was applying his ideas to society, the arrangement of society, talking with the powers that be and the political parties and rulers and leaders and trying to impose ideas out. So that's what he has in common. It's not a time-bound thing. Foucault dealing with power and structures. Kant, Kierkegaard, Le Bon with his crowds, focusing on how crowds think and behave. So more to do with democracy. From Bakunin. So we get a different emphasis when we also remove the nationality part of it there. We're away from the French Enlightenment and the French Revolution, therefore. We've even got Vivekananda as a neighbouring node to him. Vivekananda, very important person in the transmission of Buddhism to the West. Jefferson. Yeah, let's take a look at one more. Advocate for freedom of religion. His famous quote was, what was it? I don't agree with you, but I will fight for your right to have your freedom of opinion. Let's just take a look. Yeah, that was one of the main things he wanted to express, being an advocate for freedoms of religion as an expression, and that's in a timeline of Western philosophers, yeah, courtesy of Wiki, which seems to be coming of age. So in around about the same time, 1703, 1705, other people, what are they? David Hume, there we were just talking about. Empiricist and skeptic. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, social contract, political philosopher. I just want to see what the other side slightly earlier. So Voltaire, 1694 to 1778. So he's dying just as the German Romantics, and the German Romantics are very much the New Age hippies of their time. They are talking about oneness with nature, with creating your own reality, with writing novels, with doing yoga, sort of opening up to the universe, listening to your intuition. These are all things as hyenas to the church, of course. But you can see the stages being set. Montesquieu, for skepticism, humanism, for it becoming okay, both okay in the sense that you're not going to get tortured, and okay that the loosening up of thinking. Under a tyranny, a religious tyranny, you can't do that. Probably internally as well, it would be quite difficult to penetrate that kind of fear as well. All right, so let's move on. So we now start to get to the age where we're shifting towards individual rights, and this is very much, you'll see this, we don't have anything that side, we have it on the westernized values, Western philosophy, Western values, I noticed it here, is the orientation of spirituality, if you like, starts to shift. Let's just get rid of these. They're taking up a bit of space. So this is to do with Western values, this sphere. So much more emphasis you see on rationality, and there's much more emphasis on using critical faculty, emphasis on freedom, on focusing on natural laws rather than on invisible powers and anthropomorphized beings that govern us, fighting wrongs and so on. So you can see how Voltaire was part of a movement and created the movement towards that direction and away from medieval mysticism. Before that you even had like alchemy with Paracelsus, people like that, their ideas of science were nothing like these guys. Their aims and objectives as well were far different than many of those as well. So, for example, with the alchemists like Paracelsus, we had a lot of different things going on. They were doing things such as trying to turn lead and base metals into gold, and we're getting a lot of sort of state sponsorship to do that kind of thing. Here he is. So he was also in that same region. Sorry, look at me, they're a bit clustered there. Yeah, hold on. I'd like to get him from this sphere. That's what I was looking for. So he fits in amongst quite a few of these people that are under the rubric of, under the category of Hermeticism. So a lot of this is kind of mixing magic and mysticism with science. So you get this bizarre mixture of things like astrology, astronomy, numbers, chemistry, physics, with magical and religious thinking. And that starts to create an odd version of what happens internally within people, with the forces and the energies within the body. You get all kinds of strange versions of how to use metals and chemicals in there, including things such as the use of mercury and lead and gold. And the idea is also that quasi spiritual ideas like living for eternity and this kind, infinity, eternity, energy, being able to transcend death, and also these very concealed teachings, like the Rosicrucians. They had the idea of concealing meaning behind symbols and symbolism. So a lot of this symbolism, mythology, mystical medieval teachings appealed also to people later on, such as Carl Jung, who enjoyed the idea that these symbols really had a truth to be revealed through them, in terms of penetrating through to a super truths that are concealed from people. And including, we have also overt magicians, Robert Flood and John Dee. Also early on, he was with a magician in the court of Elizabeth I, and they would make prophecies to do with astrology. She consulted him about the coming Spanish Armada, what would be the outcome of the battles. Again, so these are things that were forbidden by the Buddha for his monks to do, incidentally. Again, showing the wisdom of the Buddha. All right, so there we have the Enlightenment time, which compares, you contrast between Enlightenment ideals and Eastern philosophies. It's quite an interesting study about this dialogue between what was happening in Europe and what was happening in the East. You also had people like the Genghis Khan and the Pope with opposing sort of points, and the Silk Road transmission. You also had the increasing technology of boats and maps as well, and such like. And then we also had the scientific discovery timeline which features in this, because as discoveries came through, it started to change. Is it under scientific or discoveries? I think it might be under. Just a moment. No, discovery of the unconscious, that's something else. Yeah, so it is under scientific discoveries. The scientific timeline. This is a timeline of 365 discoveries in a line form here. So we have, you can imagine with 365, there's a great film. So Galileo in 1638. Bearing in mind, so people were believing that everything was created deliberately by God. And gases and the discovery, how this was affecting medical advance and the lack of it. Spontaneous regeneration. 1669. So we're around about that time of alchemy, medieval emergence. Isaac Newton discovers that white light is a mixture of distinct coloured rays, so the prism. Bear in mind, because I've seen where the ancient Greeks were trying to unpuzzle perspective and the laws of perspective, and the views of that the painters went through is very interesting as well. The artists, and the simple effect of the discovery of the trick of the trompe d'oeil, using a lens to project onto a wall so that they could therefore then make photorealistic perspective by putting a lens in a hole in a wall, that they would then get an upside down photograph effectively on the opposite wall. So that made it an enormous effect. Previously, for many times, people just weren't able to draw the infinity of perspective. And even there are some bizarre Zeno's paradox, for example, deals with this, where if perspective works off into infinity, well, you can never get to infinity. So if you get halfway to infinity is still at the same distance away. You can get halfway there and you're still halfway there and still halfway there, for example. So that sort of puzzles them until they start getting to be able to really unravel during the Enlightenment some of these factors. (1787). So we're getting very close to. And this has enormous effect. So, for example, where the German Romantics were advocating for your, yogic kind of visions, that was the area, Jena and Berlin, where there was the biggest increase of factory building. So at the same time, you get this existential crisis going on within regular humans, where they fear, like Coleridge and Wordsworth, they fear the effect of the industrialization, and they fear this the effect it's going to have on the loss of the soul as well in people, that people will then become robotic and they will become have a great loss of meaning. So you've got this simultaneously, God starts going out of the window. We start to lose the idea of God, which everyone was revolving everything around. Before that, sentences that people would speak would contain religious thought. So you could see it was really infused in people, and that this removal of that was a time of great fear about that. At the same time, we have enormous progress pushing out into how to the possibilities of the new. So great fear and great excitement. And one of these is, of course, this one, electromagnetism. What is that really, and what's the possible? Michael Faraday, enormous influence. And then you have the others, people such as Tesla in America, and many great other inventors of the time, Edison, Marconi, making enormous progress. So these are just some of the things that go parallel. And we don't often put these side by side. So I'd just like to quickly do that. So I've got a timeline here also. We don't put those correlations, the scientific timeline there, but also the timeline of psychology I wanted to put here. Or maybe it doesn't have the word I thought it's so psychology. Oh, it says history of psychology, not timeline. That's right. So functional psychology, history of psychology. Oh, that's not right. That's just one of them. Let me just go through again. Psychology. I think it just was named without putting the. No, that's the sphere, isn't it? I've got a timeline of psychiatry done and psychology. So where's that gone? History of psychiatry. Let me put history in because I want to just put that. So history of psychiatry, history of materialism, history of psychology. That's what I was looking for. Here we go. So if you put, often these aren't seen in context to each other. Yeah, where's the actual line? Just a moment. Unless I removed it because it was so huge. Could have done. Excuse me, just one moment. Here we go. Yeah. Where are all those then? There's 365 nodes attached there. This is what I'm trying to show you. Let me just zoom away from the actual node. I'm going to just rotate it to see whether it's linked up with a history of psychology. History of psychiatry. Oh no, I don't want to have that one open because then it sees all of those. Go on, close. Oh dear. I'm going to have to go again. History. Now we're back to sanity. Got just 5 things we can look through. The history of psychology, history of psychiatry, history of psychiatry, history of materialism. That's very strange. Psychology. There it is. Found it. That's the one I was looking for. Pazed, possessed. So, yeah, so you've got your scientific discoveries happening. And they're purely dealing with, materials and chemicals and so on, and glass and plastics and bakelite and so on like this. Simultaneously, then you've got this other world, which often they're divorced, and often this is the big weakness of the Western system, is that the psychology and the physics get separated out, encouraged to do that by the university system. So Karen Horney, for example, she's enormously influential because she disagreed and separated from Freud, who was steering everybody in the direction of his theories on cause and effect. And she separated out. And I find if you read spend a lot of time on Freud's ideas, and you get into the gist of it, the Oedipus complex, the growth stages, the dream analysis, the free association, the deep relaxation, the hypnotic style. If you suddenly switch over to Karen Horney's ideas, they're much more sensible and modern. She was much more about this is neurotic, this is individual, and different idealized selves, and very clear. And also she accused him of being quite genderist, whereas hers is not gender-based. Whereas with Jung and Freud, you get an emphasis on anima and animus, and a very male-centric view, which people are accusing Freud of getting his ideas from his own life too much, which is obviously male. So very key movements were happening, including Jung trying to create a science of a new science which hadn't existed before, called psychology. So there's a great book called "A Dream of the Science," a dream of the science, something like that. Science of the dream. Dream of science. The dream of a science, I think it's called. That's right. About Carl Jung trying to create this new territory that wasn't philosophy, and it wasn't anthropology, and it wasn't exactly psychiatry, it wasn't exactly biology, and it wasn't exactly metaphysics. They wanted a new space to create, and it was going to be called psychology. But he was still sort of trying to gather evidence for it, largely based on mythology study, on paganistic ideas, ancient Greek ideas. So he was kind of trying to build it on an ideology that he already had as a foregone conclusion, that this is the way the mind and the soul and the spirit and the universe works. So then it becomes more like an ideology. So many key people here. So it's very good to be able to look at their ideas and also see, from my point of view, where they differed and concurred with a Buddhist direction, and where their concepts or their aims or their views often led them into a rabbit hole of sorts and away from solutions and closure, such as with, I think happened with Jung, was he was trying to, when the limit, the unlimited nature of dreams, the unlimited of imagination, the unlimited amount of using historical references, and the almost unlimited amount of anthropology of tribal and ancient things, that starts to become, when you start fusing those together and multiplying them, you end up with a never-ending story that will always be unraveling and never be able to reach an end. So that was kind of the problem with that. Whereas the Buddha's was very much a completed package. And that's one of the big differences. Okay, I think which direction? Yeah, time-wise, we're going up to the sort of towards the current day. So let's whiz forward to the time of contemporary Western culture and see, where that's got with psychology, at least on this list anyway. 1973, the American Psychiatric Association declassifies homosexuality as a mental disorder. So how far have we come since 1973, sort of thing? Again, the Buddha not making a big stance on the things like that wisely, unlike people like Adler, who posited it as a form of sort of failure to become a real man. So there's some very influential things here that I recognise. Alice Miller, The Drama of the Gifted Child, so that was 1979. There's so many. There's another point is that factors and facts start to increase as we get closer to time. The proliferation of recorded written text online and printed, as opposed to the olden days. Like Socrates, nothing written down, just anecdotal from people who were there. So where did we get to here? 2014, 2015, bars a psychologist from participating in something or other. Yeah, right, okay, well, let's we're in the 2020s, what happens here? Probably COVID or something. Pandemic, there we go, yeah. And so on. And then we've probably got a lot of eco. Yeah, which is kind of bringing us sort of up to date there. And I mean, if you look at the timeline of psychiatry, there's a lot of grisly ghosts in the cupboards there from their experiments. So we'll cover those things in another time. So let's just fly off into space, the final frontier. Thank you very much for your time. Let's brought us up more or less to the current day. I'll join me on another fly-through adventure of exploring East-West in a forthcoming video. Thank you very much and take care.